In the modern world, the word compassion is widely used, yet rarely understood in the way it was meant in the early teachings of the Buddha. In many spiritual communities, mindfulness circles, or therapeutic spaces, compassion is often associated with soft-heartedness, emotional empathy, or feeling the pain of others deeply. To be compassionate is frequently seen as having an open heart that suffers with others, cries with them, and carries their burdens. This emotionalized view of compassion is not wrong in intent. It springs from kindness, but it is dangerously incomplete. It does not reflect the depth and precision of what the Buddha meant by karuṇā, the Pāli word for compassion. True compassion, as taught in the early Buddhist texts, is not a wave of emotion that overwhelms us. It is a form of selfless wisdom that sees suffering clearly and responds with equanimity, without identification, without exhaustion, and without the ego's involvement. In today's emotionally charged world, the boundaries between feeling and wisdom are often blurred. We are taught to feel deeply, to empathize completely, and to express sorrow with those who suffer. But what happens when we feel too much? What happens when the pain of others becomes our pain, not in a wholesome way, but in a way that exhausts and confuses us? Many spiritual practitioners, caregivers, and even therapists speak of compassion fatigue, the burnout that comes from being overwhelmed by the suffering of others. But this very phrase reveals the misunderstanding. True compassion does not cause fatigue because true compassion is not emotional absorption. It is inner clarity, calm responsiveness, and wise non-attachment. The Buddha's teachings are radical not because they are cold or detached, but because they invite us to look beyond the surface of our habitual reactions. In his framework, compassion arises not from identification with others, but from the direct realization that all beings suffer due to causes and conditions. Compassion, then, is not, I feel your pain, but I see the nature of pain, and I understand the causes behind it. This is not indifference. It is the opposite of indifference. It is active, present, fearless seeing. When a person is drowning, the Buddha does not ask us to jump into the water and drown with them. He teaches us to reach out from stable ground, with wisdom, steadiness, and clarity, so that we can truly be of help. This distinction between emotional compassion and wise compassion is more than philosophical. It is essential for a spiritual life grounded in freedom. If our so-called compassion is driven by guilt, identification, or personal trauma, we may end up reinforcing suffering rather than alleviating it. We may become attached to our role as the helper, or emotionally devastated by our inability to change the world. But when compassion is rooted in selflessness and anattā, the insight that there is no permanent I to defend or promote, it becomes boundless, effortless, and non-reactive. It becomes the pure movement of a liberated mind responding to dukkha wherever it appears, not because it must, not because it seeks reward, but simply because it sees. This teaching is not easy to grasp. It requires a shift from the emotional mind to the contemplative mind, from the reactive heart to the reflective awareness that sees beyond self and other. It requires letting go of the idea that we must feel pain to understand pain. It invites us to awaken a kind of compassion that is not of the world, not clinging, not sorrowful, not self-congratulatory, but luminous, still, and spacious. The compassion of the Buddha does not cry, it understands. The purpose of this lecture is to explore deeply this original, profound understanding of karuṇā in the early Buddhist texts. We will unearth the wisdom behind compassion, the selflessness that empowers it, and the stillness that supports it. We will see why compassion, when mixed with ego or emotional clinging, becomes distorted, and how, when rooted in insight and non-self, it becomes a liberating force, both for the one who offers it and the one who receives it. We will travel through key teachings from the Pāli Canon, reflect on examples from the Buddha's life, and examine how to embody this form of compassion in meditation, speech, and action. This is not a lecture for those who seek comfort in sentiment. It is a talk for those who are ready to question the emotional assumptions they carry, and who wish to cultivate a heart that is both open and unshakably wise. For in the end, compassion is not about how much we feel, it is about how clearly we see. To understand the true nature of compassion in the Buddha's teaching, we must return to the original language in which it was transmitted, Pāli. The word karuṇā, so often translated simply as compassion, is far richer and more nuanced than its English counterpart. In the early discourses of the Buddha, Karuṇā is not an emotion that fluctuates with the mood of the heart, nor is it a sentimental response to the pain of others. It is a deep, stable, non-personal force that arises from insight into the nature of suffering. It is one of the four Brahmaviharas, the sublime or divine abodes, alongside metta, mudita, and upekkha. These four are not emotional states, but purified mental attitudes, cultivated through repeated contemplation and disciplined mental training. Karuṇā, in this context, is the natural, unshakable wish for beings to be free from suffering. It arises not from pity, not from sorrow, and certainly not from personal sadness. It is born of a mind that has seen into the structure of reality, a mind that knows that suffering does not define a person, but rather results from causes and conditions, craving, clinging, ignorance. When we understand this, we no longer need to feel burdened by the pain of others in a way that overwhelms us. We are not required to suffer with them. Instead, we begin to see suffering clearly and respond with clarity. This is what makes Karuṇā a sublime state, not because it is pleasant, but because it is untainted by ego, projection, or emotional confusion. In the Pāli Canon, Karuṇā is cultivated through meditation as a boundless state of mind. The practitioner develops it by extending the wish, may all beings be free from suffering, first to oneself, then to loved ones, then to neutral persons, and finally to those considered enemies or difficult people. In doing so, one trains the heart to respond with evenness, without partiality, and without collapse. It is essential to note that this training is not based on feeling more, but on letting go of barriers. The problem with emotional compassion is that it is selective. We weep for those we love, grow cold toward those we dislike, and remain indifferent to the stranger. But Karuṇā does not discriminate. It does not rely on the personal history we share with someone. It does not require us to feel emotional warmth. It is based on the universal recognition that suffering is suffering, no matter who experiences it. This compassion is not born from pain, but from clarity. It is the clarity that sees dukkha for what it is, an impersonal process arising due to causes. This is why, in many suttas, the Buddha is described as responding to suffering not with sorrow, but with teachings. When he meets those in grief or despair, he does not share their emotional turmoil. Instead, he skillfully points them toward insight, toward understanding the nature of loss, impermanence, and the empty nature of self. This is not a lack of heart. This is the deepest expression of Karuṇā. For what is more compassionate than helping someone uproot the very ignorance that binds them to suffering? One striking aspect of Karuṇā in the early texts is how often it is paired with wisdom, paṇā. The two are not separate. True compassion arises when one sees reality with wisdom. If compassion arises without wisdom, it quickly turns into emotional overwhelm, moral superiority, or rescuing behavior. A person might help others out of guilt, out of an identity as a good person, or from a deep psychological need to be needed. But such motivations, though outwardly kind, are inwardly rooted in the self. They do not free the helper or the helped. Wisdom cuts through this illusion. It knows that there is no solid me helping a solid you. There is only suffering arising in this moment, and a mind choosing to respond from clarity instead of confusion. The Buddha's own example shines here. He did not walk around with a heavy heart. He was not emotionally devastated by the world's suffering. He was not driven by grief, but by understanding. His mind remained still, peaceful, and luminous even as he taught those afflicted by pain, loss, or death. His Karuṇā did not depend on emotion. It was grounded in awakening. In fact, it was his awakening that made his compassion boundless. No longer seeing others through the lens of self and other, he could truly serve them without clinging, without exhaustion, and without the trap of identification. This distinction between emotional compassion and awakened Karuṇā is subtle, yet transformative. Many people equate the absence of strong feeling with coldness. But in the Dhamma, it is the heat of craving and identification that fuels suffering, not its absence. The Buddha's path leads to coolness, nibbana, literally the extinguishing of the flames. Karuṇā is the gentle movement of a heart that has been cooled by insight, and because it is cool, it is steady. It can endure the suffering of the world without breaking down. It can see pain without flinching. It can act without ego. That is why it is sublime. To truly understand Karuṇā is to realize that we do not need to be moved by emotion in order to care. We only need to be free of delusion. The one who sees clearly will naturally respond with compassion, not out of duty, not out of guilt, not out of a desire to be seen as good, but simply because compassion is what wisdom looks like when it touches the world. To speak of true compassion in the Dhamma is to speak of selflessness. The deeper one's understanding of anattā, the clearer the nature of karuṇā becomes. In the ordinary, worldly view, compassion often takes the form of a self reaching out to help another self, a subject acting upon an object. There is a giver and a receiver, a helper and the helped. While this may seem noble on the surface, beneath it often lies subtle attachment to identity, to moral superiority, to emotional payoff. The Buddha's compassion, however, does not arise from any notion of I helping you. It flows from a mind that has let go of self-construction and instead sees only processes, causes, and conditions. In this vision, there are not beings in the absolute sense. There are only events unfolding in accordance with Dhamma. Compassion in such a mind is not an act performed by someone. It is the spontaneous response of wisdom to suffering, without the interference of ego. When one understands the principle of anattā, the illusion of separateness begins to dissolve. The boundaries that define my pain and your pain become thinner, less rigid, until it is clear that suffering is not personal. It is not mine, not yours. It is simply an impersonal experience arising and passing due to causes. And because there is no permanent, unchanging self behind the pain, there is also no one to defend, no one to protect, no one to be proud of in the act of compassion. This insight removes the clinging that often infects emotional forms of compassion, the subtle sense of, I am a good person for caring, or they owe me for my kindness. Or even, why do I suffer so much when I try to help others? Such thoughts arise only when compassion is tangled up in self-view. But when compassion arises in the absence of self, it is clean, simple, luminous. It asks for nothing. It expects nothing. It is not a performance, it is a presence. One of the most striking illustrations of this principle can be found in the stories of the Buddha's encounters with those who suffered the most. Consider the story of Kisa Gautami, a young mother driven mad with grief after the death of her only child. She wandered from house to house with the lifeless body of her son, begging for medicine to bring him back to life. At last, someone directed her to the Buddha. When she arrived, wild with sorrow, he did not weep with her. He did not speak of heaven or offer comforting stories. Instead, he told her to collect a handful of mustard seeds from any home in the village, as long as no one in that household had ever experienced death. She searched the entire village, but in every house, someone had died. Only then did she begin to see what the Buddha already knew, that death is universal and grief arises from clinging. He did not remove her pain with emotional warmth. He guided her beyond it, using wisdom as a compass. That was his compassion. This is the essence of karuṇā rooted in non-self. It sees the root of suffering not in the surface event, but in the mind's reaction to it, in craving, in ignorance, in the illusion of permanence. The Buddha's compassion was surgical. It cut through delusion rather than embracing it. He did not reinforce stories of injustice or victimhood. He did not feed identity. He helped beings let go. His compassion, though seemingly quiet, was the most powerful medicine. And he could offer it fully because he was not entangled in a personal self that needed anything in return. In this way, the deeper one's realization of anattā, the more stable and spacious one's compassion becomes. Without a self to protect, there is nothing to fear in the suffering of others. Without a self to praise, there is no pride in helping. Without a self to preserve, there is no burnout, because there is no one carrying the burden. Karuṇā, in this framework, is not a weight one must bear. It is a natural expression of freedom. And because it does not rely on ego, it does not deplete the mind. On the contrary, it refreshes it, because it is aligned with truth. Such compassion is not passive. It does not ignore suffering or retreat into apathy. On the contrary, it is often more effective, more courageous, and more precise than emotional forms of care. A selfless mind does not hesitate in the face of pain. It does not freeze, collapse, or overreact. It sees suffering and responds, not from pity, not from fear, but from wisdom. It knows what is helpful and what is not, because it sees causes and conditions clearly. And it knows that to truly help others, one must not be caught in their suffering, nor in one's own projections. In the monastery, we see this type of compassion in daily acts, monks caring for the sick without emotional resistance, without judgment, without fatigue. A dying brother is not an occasion for panic or sorrow. It is an opportunity to remain present, to offer water, to clean the body, to chant softly, not for show, not to feel good, but because it is what the moment asks. No one owns the compassion. It arises naturally when the self steps aside. This is the training that the Buddha taught, not to be ruled by feeling, but to be guided by understanding. In truth, the more we examine it, the more we realize that the presence of self is the greatest obstacle to true compassion. When I am involved, I become fragile. I want to be appreciated, I become exhausted, I take it personally if I fail. But when the illusion of self fades, karuṇā becomes boundless. It does not begin with me, and therefore it does not end with me. It is like sunlight, it shines equally on all, without effort, without preference, without need. This is why the Buddha said that compassion and wisdom must go together. Compassion without wisdom becomes sentiment. Wisdom without compassion becomes dryness. But together, they form the awakened heart, firm in clarity, soft in presence, and free from self. This heart does not ask, "What do I feel?" but rather, "What is needed now?" And that simple question, asked without ego, answered without clinging, is the doorway to liberation. While compassion is universally praised and encouraged, it is important to understand that not all forms of compassion are wholesome or beneficial. In fact, when misunderstood, compassion can become a source of great suffering, not only for the one who receives it, but especially for the one who gives it. This happens when compassion is not grounded in wisdom but in emotion, identification, or unconscious motives. Emotional compassion, though often praised in the modern world as a sign of kindness and virtue, can in truth be unstable, reactive, and even harmful. The Buddha's path warns us against unexamined emotions, no matter how noble they may appear, and compassion is no exception. The danger of emotional compassion lies first in its tendency to overwhelm the practitioner. When compassion is rooted in emotional resonance rather than wisdom, it easily becomes compassion fatigue. This is a common phrase in modern psychological and caregiving circles, and it describes the exhaustion, numbness, or despair that arises when one is constantly exposed to the suffering of others without sufficient mental stability or clarity. The caregiver begins by feeling with the sufferer, crying with them, aching for them, but over time, the shared suffering becomes too much to bear. The helper is consumed. They begin to burn out, retreat emotionally, or fall into depression. And yet the Buddha never described karuṇā in this way. Nowhere in the canon do we see the enlightened ones weeping or collapsing under the burden of the world's pain. Why? Because their compassion was not built on emotional identification, it was built on seeing. This burnout is not the result of too much compassion, it is the result of wrong compassion. It is the compassion of someone who is still entangled in the idea of self. I must fix the world. I cannot rest while others suffer. I am responsible for everyone's happiness. These thoughts, though they sound noble, are actually forms of ego disguised as virtue. They place the burden of the world on one's shoulders, reinforcing a false sense of personal control and identity. The more one believes these thoughts, the heavier the weight becomes, and eventually, the body and mind can no longer bear it. Real karuṇā, in contrast, is light, spacious, and effortless. It does not say, "I must fix this." It simply responds from clarity, without attachment to outcomes. Another danger of emotional compassion is that it often hides subtle forms of attachment or pride. A person may feel compassion not out of true care, but out of a desire to be seen as kind, helpful, or morally superior. They help others because it reinforces their self-image as a good person. They give to charity and want to be praised. They counsel others and want to be needed. But such compassion is transactional. It seeks reward, affirmation, or control. And because it is rooted in the self, it always remains limited. When the receiver of help is ungrateful or rejects the offering, the giver becomes hurt or resentful. When the world does not change despite their efforts, they grow bitter or cynical. This reveals that the original impulse, though clothed in the language of compassion, was in fact a strategy for self-preservation. This kind of emotional compassion also risks reinforcing the suffering of others. When we pity someone, when we emotionally collapse with them, we may accidentally affirm their sense of victimhood or helplessness. Instead of empowering them to understand their own suffering and its causes, we mirror their despair. We cry with them, not because we see clearly, but because we are entangled. This can create dependency or confusion. The person in pain sees us suffer, and it either adds to their burden or draws them into a mutual identification where no one is free. True karuṇā, by contrast, offers space and stability. It does not sink, it floats. It invites others to rise, not by dragging them upward, but by standing firm in insight and stillness. What then does compassion with wisdom look like? It looks like a deep calm in the face of pain. It does not deny suffering, nor is it indifferent to it, but it does not tremble before it. Instead of reacting with emotional heat, it responds with balanced presence. It does not say, "Poor you," but rather, "This is suffering. Let us understand it together." The practitioner of wise compassion knows that suffering is not merely a story or a tragedy. It is a process governed by laws. There is craving, there is clinging, there is ignorance, and there is a way out. This knowledge informs the response. One speaks not to console the ego, but to awaken the mind. One acts not to impress, but to liberate. To cultivate this kind of compassion, one must develop upekkha, equanimity. This is not coldness, but steadiness. It is the mental balance that holds space for suffering without becoming unbalanced by it. Upekkha prevents karuṇā from becoming sentimental. It guards against burnout, reaction, and partiality. The two together form an unshakable foundation for wise action. Without upekkha, karuṇā may flare up and burn out. But with upekkha, karuṇā becomes sustainable, boundless, and free. The great beauty of this teaching is that it liberates us from the false belief that we must carry the weight of the world. It reminds us that we are not here to fix everything. We are here to understand. And in that understanding, we act, not because we must, not because we seek reward, but because it is the natural movement of a mind free from illusion. Such compassion does not need to feel dramatic. It is often quiet, invisible, and ordinary. A kind word, a mindful act, a wise silence. These are the forms that true compassion takes when ego no longer interferes. In the end, emotional compassion, for all its warmth, is still entangled in identity. It feels personal, heavy, and sometimes chaotic. But the compassion that arises from inside is serene. It is gentle without weakness, powerful without aggression, and clear without coldness. It knows that helping does not mean absorbing pain. It means understanding it, responding with wisdom, and letting go. When we see this clearly, we stop trying to feel more. Instead, we learn to see more. And in that seeing, true karuṇā is born, not as a burden, but as a natural expression of awakening. The cultivation of true compassion does not happen by accident. It is not the result of having a tender heart or a naturally empathetic personality. In the Buddha's path, compassion is a skill, one that can be developed, refined, and perfected through consistent practice grounded in right view. The mind is not born knowing how to respond wisely to suffering. It must be trained. And this training begins with meditation, continues with daily mindfulness, and is sealed by the deep understanding of non-self. Karuṇā is not a momentary feeling. It is the flowering of a heart and mind that have been shaped by the Dhamma. In meditation, we begin by inclining the mind toward compassion in a structured way. This is not about forcing emotion, but about cultivating a particular mental attitude, a wish for beings to be free from suffering. The traditional practice starts with oneself, not out of selfishness, but because we cannot offer to others what we have not developed within. Sitting quietly, breathing gently, we bring to mind the phrase, "May I be free from suffering." But this wish is not spoken as a demand or a hope. It is spoken from a place of stillness and sincerity. It is a recognition that suffering exists, and that the heart naturally inclines toward its cessation. From oneself, the circle expands to a beloved person, to a neutral person, to a difficult person, and finally to all beings. With each expansion, we are not trying to generate a feeling, but to soften the boundary that separates me from you, us from them. In doing so, we are not just becoming more compassionate. We are training the mind to recognize the impersonal nature of dukkha. Suffering is not a personal tragedy, it is a universal truth. The more we realize this, the less reactive our compassion becomes. It no longer flares up only for those we care about. It becomes a stable and unshakable presence available to all. What is essential in this training is that we do not cling to the outcome. When we radiate karuṇā, we are not trying to fix the world or change anyone. We are simply training the mind to meet suffering with a specific response, not aversion, not sorrow, not avoidance, but clarity and goodwill. The practice is inward, even though its effects may ripple outward. Whether or not anyone notices or changes is irrelevant. What matters is that the heart is being reshaped, purified of selfishness, fear, and reactivity. Beyond formal meditation, compassion must be practiced in daily life. This is where the teachings leave the cushion and enter the marketplace, the home, the hospital, the street. Here, we meet the real test. Can we remain present and clear in the face of real suffering? Not just imagined suffering in meditation, but actual pain, confusion, cruelty, and despair. When someone lashes out at us, can we see their suffering instead of their aggression? When we witness injustice, can we act without hatred? When we are overwhelmed by the cries of the world, can we stay grounded in wisdom rather than swept away by emotion? These are not easy tasks, but they are possible when we understand that compassion is not about feeling more. It is about reacting less. When the mind is no longer compulsively reacting to every stimulus, every story, every wound, it gains space. In that space, insight arises. And from insight comes skillful action. We begin to see that sometimes compassion means speaking, and sometimes it means staying silent. Sometimes it means helping, and sometimes it means letting others find their own strength. There is no single formula. The heart that sees clearly knows what is needed, not from logic or emotion, but from direct perception of causes and conditions. Another critical aspect of this training is letting go of guilt-based compassion. Many people carry the unexamined belief that they must help others because they are privileged, lucky, safe, or spiritually developed. This belief, though seemingly ethical, is still centered on the self. I must help because I have more. But this reinforces the illusion of inequality and separation. It keeps compassion transactional. True kara has nothing to do with guilt. The Buddha never taught us to feel bad about being free from suffering. He taught us to understand suffering and respond wisely, not out of obligation, but out of freedom. Guilt-based compassion often leads to self-sacrifice and resentment. We give too much, say yes too often, and then wonder why we feel depleted. But the Buddha's model was never one of depletion. He gave endlessly because there was no self to be drained. His actions were not reactive, but natural. He did not give from guilt or pressure, but from wisdom. This is why his compassion never faltered. If we wish to follow his path, we must abandon the idea that compassion means emotional martyrdom. We must instead root our actions in clarity. Ultimately, the training in true compassion leads to a profound inner freedom. We no longer suffer when others suffer, not because we are insensitive, but because we have gone beyond identification. We can meet pain directly without collapsing. We can act skillfully without expectation. We can care without clinging. This is not indifference, it is liberation. And it is from this liberated space that the most effective, wise, and fearless compassion emerges. The path of Karu is not about becoming softer, it is about becoming clearer. It is not about increasing our emotional bandwidth, it is about dissolving the self who believes it must carry everything. The more we see into the emptiness of self, the more we realize that compassion is not something we do, it is something that arises naturally when the mind is free. We do not have to try to be compassionate. We only have to remove the obstacles. When the heart is no longer blocked by fear, attachment, or identity, Kara flows effortlessly, like a river freed from a dam. This is the heart of the Buddha's teaching. That the end of suffering does not come from avoiding pain or absorbing pain, but from understanding it. And when that understanding is deep, steady, and selfless, compassion is no longer an effort, it becomes a way of being. It becomes the natural fragrance of a mind that has touched freedom. To truly understand the nature of compassion and the Buddha's teaching is to undergo a quiet revolution in the heart. What the world calls compassion is often a movement of feeling intense, heartfelt, sympathetic, and deeply personal. It weeps with the world, collapses with the suffering of others, and often wears its exhaustion like a badge of honor. But the Dhamma points in a different direction. It asks us not to feel more, but to see more clearly. Not to get lost in suffering, but to comprehend its roots. Not to be carried by emotion, but to be grounded in wisdom. This is the gift of the Buddha's teaching. It transforms compassion from a fragile emotion into an unshakable force. Karuṇā, in its highest form, is not reactive. It is not dependent on who is suffering or how much, or whether the person is close to us or a stranger. It is not bound by stories, personal histories, or moral judgments. It is simply a clear, unconfused response to the truth of dukkha. When the mind no longer identifies with the self, when it no longer takes suffering personally, then compassion becomes pure, free of agenda, free of self-congratulation, free of fear. It moves like wind, present, gentle, and without origin. It acts when necessary, speaks when needed, and remains silent when silence serves. It is not about drama, intensity, or being seen. It is about knowing what truly helps and letting go of everything that does not. This is why karuṇā must be understood in connection with wisdom. Alone, compassion is easily led astray by attachment, aversion, and ignorance. But when it is illuminated by insight, when it is fused with the clear seeing of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and non-self, it becomes boundless and balanced. The Buddha's compassion was not moved by sentimentality. It was rooted in liberation. He did not heal by absorbing suffering, but by exposing its cause. He did not console with false promises. He offered the path beyond grief. His presence was not emotional warmth, but a stillness that penetrated delusion and set beings free. This is the path we are invited to follow. Not the path of the emotional heart, fragile and easily disturbed, but the path of the wise heart, still, vast, and fearless. A heart that knows how to care without clinging, how to act without self, how to give without exhaustion. In this way, the practitioner of Dhamma becomes a true refuge in the world, not by saving others through force, but by embodying the possibility of freedom. To train in this compassion is to align ourselves with the deepest currents of the Buddha's way. It is to bow to suffering not in despair, but in understanding. It is to see that suffering cannot be erased through emotion, nor through control, but only through insight. And it is to realize that compassion is not something we must manufacture. It is already there, waiting to arise when the self is no longer obstructing it. Like sunlight behind the clouds, it shines naturally when delusion fades. In your own life, this kind of compassion may not look dramatic. It may not be visible to others, but it will be known inwardly as a steady presence that meets pain without shrinking, as a quiet voice that responds without seeking attention, as an inner stillness that allows you to keep walking through this world, sensitive but not shattered, responsive but not reactive, open but not overwhelmed. You will begin to see that every moment of suffering in others is not a demand for you to feel more, but an invitation to see more. And in seeing clearly, your actions will become simpler, wiser, and freer. You will help when you can, and accept when you cannot. You will act from a place that is not trying to be good, but simply trying to be awake. This is the great transformation that the Dhamma makes possible. The movement from emotional turbulence to luminous presence, from compulsive helping to selfless service, from identity-driven care to compassionate wisdom. It is a path that does not deny feeling, but transcends it. A path that does not reject emotion, but refuses to be ruled by it. In the end, the compassion that the Buddha taught is not a heavy burden, nor a bleeding heart. It is a clear mind and a free heart. A mind that sees dukkha as it is, and a heart that responds, not because it must, not because it hopes, but because it is free to do so. And that is the greatest compassion of all, not to suffer for others, but to awaken for them. When karuṇā and pāṇā walk together, the world is no longer something to fix, it is something to understand. And in that understanding, we discover a compassion that is tireless, formless, and beyond self. This is the compassion of the awakened ones, and it is available to each of us the moment we stop trying to become someone and instead begin to see things as they are.